You're live.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, dear students. I am pleased to open the Pre-COP26 Knowledge Exchange Dialogue for Climate, Nature, and People, hosted by York University's Sifal Center. We are excited to welcome, as of last night, 115 participants from 11 different countries. I am Idil Boran, Associate Professor and Associate Director of Sifal York at York University in Canada. York University is located on traditional land that precedes the establishment of the university. The area is known as Takaranto and has been taken care of by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many Inuit, First Nations, and Métis communities. The current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region, the world's largest system of fresh water. Acknowledging the land is important to us as hosts of this workshop, as we work tirelessly on research and outreach for accelerated action on biodiversity and climate change simultaneously and aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. This workshop was made possible through our partnerships. At York University, our partners are York International, the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability, the Synergies of Planetary Health Research Initiative, and the Dadale Institute for Global Health Research, which funds the research initiative, the Synergies of Planetary Health Research Initiative, which also receives funding from the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies and the SSHRC Exchange Knowledge Mobilization Fund. Our international partners are the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial College London in the UK and the German Development Institute, Deutsches Institut für Entwicklungspolitik, based in Bonn in Germany. We welcome all our partners and our audience, and I now have the pleasure to invite the President and Vice Chancellor of York University for welcoming remarks. President Lenton, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Bonjour, bonjour. On behalf of York University, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to Sifal York's inaugural event, Pre-COP26, Knowledge Exchange for Climate, Nature, and People. Sifal York acts as a hub for knowledge translation and innovative thinking that extends beyond traditional boundaries and serves to address society's most urgent demands, including those identified in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We know that our success in affecting the kind of systemic changes necessary to address both planetary biodiversity and climate emergencies relies on our ability to enhance multi-sector collaborations and strengthen multi-stakeholder action. And so we are grateful to the researchers, practitioners, educators, and the community partners who have joined us today for this critical dialogue, which is aptly timed as a precursor to the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. At York University, our community approaches sustainability through a holistic lens of collaboration, innovation, and knowledge mobilization, underscored by our desire to build a safer, more sustainable, and more inclusive future. Sustainability is one of the foundations of our University Academic Plan 2025, Building a Better Future. And it is embedded within all of our 6 priorities for action as part of our commitment to strengthening our impact on the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through research, through learning, our curriculum, intersectoral outreach, partnership building, and praxis on our campuses. As part of this commitment, we are ensuring that sustainable innovation is visible and tangible. For example, we are leveraging the university's social procurement policies and practices to positively impact the social and environmental well-being of our surrounding communities. We're providing students with valuable experiential opportunities related to ecology, sustainability, Indigenous education, arts, health, and conservation through the innovative use of our campuses as living labs, including through the groundbreaking Las Nubes project at our Eco Campus in Costa Rica, and committing to the ambitious goal of becoming carbon neutral on, or preferably before, 2049 by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the ecological footprint of the university and our institutional activities. These initiatives and the many others being undertaken at York are continuing to strengthen the university's international reputation in sustainability. In fact, this year, the university was named one of Canada's greenest employers for the 9th consecutive year in a row. And for the 3rd year in a row, the university has been recognized as a global leader in the Times Higher Education Global Impact Rankings. And so I want to thank Sifal York, our international partners at the Grantham Institute for Climate and the Environment at Imperial College London and the German Development Institute, as well as our partners from across the university, including York International, the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability, the synergies of Planetary Health Research Initiative and Lab with the support of the Dudley Institute for Global Health Research and the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies for bringing us together today to discuss ways that we can strengthen our multi-sectoral approaches to addressing global challenges such as climate change, and for providing us with an opportunity to work together to write the future. Thank you so much. Merci, miigwech.
Thank you, President Lenton. I now invite the Executive Director of Sifal York, Professor Ali Asghari. Ali, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hello, friends, colleagues, and guests. On behalf of the entire team at York, Sifal York, it is indeed my great pleasure to welcome you to this very important and exciting event. Sifal York goal is to organize and co-organize many events like this, where we can share knowledge, experience, and ideas, and learn from each other. Sifal York emphasizes on training and knowledge sharing events that enable us and our societies to better address disaster and emergencies, above all climate change, makes our local, national, and global built and natural environment more sustainable, equitable, and healthy. We wish you success in co-achieving the goals of this event and looking forward to see the outcomes of your workshops, reaching out to the COP26 and beyond. Sifal York is ready to collaborate with you and with your agencies in activities like this in the future. Thank you very much. Back to you, Idel.
Thank you, Ali. Much appreciated. I now invite the Executive Director of York International, Vinita Gangatayan. Vinita, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dil and Sifal, for your commitment, leadership, and vision in bringing together this important event ahead of COP26. As the President mentioned, cross-sector collaboration and partnerships are truly at the center of shaping the global climate agenda. For real change to take root and nurture, working together is not just important, but it is a national and global imperative. Here at York, we believe in the power of partnerships. There are a number of partnerships that have already been mentioned in place locally and globally to act on climate action and to advance other UN Sustainable Development Goals. So much so that York University has ranked 27th in the world in the impact ranking that measures the strength of university partnerships to support UN SDGs. Local, national, and global partnerships and collaboration is urgently needed on a daily basis, not just during COP events or UN climate action agenda, on a daily basis to counter the most pressing issue of our time. Thank you so much to our global partners and the partners within York University for coming together to share knowledge, ideas, and most importantly, to take action to secure our common future. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinita. I now invite the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability here at York University, Professor Charles Hopkins. Charles, the floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you, Associate Director Dr. Baran, and hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be a partner in this pre-COP dialogue. The goals of the event align so well with the mandate of our UNESCO chair. The linking of climate action, the safeguarding of the planet's biodiversity, and tackling other sustainable development issues brings forward the need for integrated and cross-sectoral solutions. And most of all, the overarching need for education to make sense of these complex and multi-layered issues. Education combined with public awareness and training has a crucial role in tackling the many sustainability issues facing humanity. In the Paris Agreement, as well as the 2030 Agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals, education is brought forward as a key enabler for the ability of both the individual and as a collective to seek the knowledge, the skills, and values to become citizens who will actually actively strive towards a more sustainable future. So by addressing issues in an integrated context such as we are planning to do in this dialogue, we're assuming our responsibility as academics. I look forward to the discussions, and thank you again, Dr. Baran.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins. And now I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Ines Dombrowski, Head of Program Environmental Governance at the German Development Institute, one of our international partners. Ines, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Ida. Dear participants and partners, I'm very delighted to welcome you all to this dialogue on behalf of the German Development Institute, DIE. At the DIE, we do research, applied research, and policy advice on issues of global development and combine it with training. And as such, we try to build bridges between theory and practice. In the environmental governance research program, we focus on the interlinked climate, biodiversity, and natural resource governance issues and the integrated implementation of the SDGs. Against this background, I think that this session is really timely, as it's of huge importance to address the two global megatrends of climate change and rapid loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services simultaneously. Indeed, joint action for climate making people at multiple levels is central to the debates of the upcoming climate COP26 and also to the biodiversity COP15. In view of our work profile, we really highly appreciate the partnership with Sifal York and her leadership development, and we very much appreciate this joint initiative to facilitate interdisciplinary and participatory knowledge exchange on the COP15 through a series of meetings. I now would like to thank already all the speakers and participants for their contributions, and I wish you fruitful discussions today.
Thank you dearly, Ines. We value our partnership with the German Development Institute. And now, last but not least, I have the pleasure to invite Alyssa Gilbert, the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial College London. Alyssa, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Idil, and for inviting us to be your partners in this event. As Idil mentioned, we're delighted to represent the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment as a partner with York University and other partners in this event today, but also in the event that we'll be running together at the climate change negotiations in Glasgow in COP26 in just a few weeks' time. Our institute is a cross-university institute at Imperial College in London. And what we try to do is make the best use of the academic expertise that we have across our whole university to try and mobilize that research and that knowledge to genuinely have an impact on the way in which we as humans engage with our environment and to help us tackle climate change. Of course, these two twin aims of our institute to help tackle climate change, but also to help protect biodiversity and the environment are very, very closely intertwined. It's often a concern of ours that by looking only through a climate change lens or through a biodiversity protection lens, we don't actually optimize how we can improve that interaction between humans and our environment and the world around us. And therefore, it's vitally important to have an activity like this event over the next few days where we talk about the interactions between climate and nature. And that's why we were so keen to have an event at the climate change negotiations with you as partners coming up in a few weeks' time on this precise topic. And for us, success in this space is really all about collaboration. And this is a really fantastic way for us to collaborate internationally and with a wide range of people and perspectives from the research and academic through to people acting on the ground so that we can all make a difference together. So thank you for having us here as part of the event.
Alyssa, thank you so much. Very well put. It's a perfect introduction. We value our partnerships. And now I am very pleased to open the workshop. We have a great workshop for you today and tomorrow. We are excited to welcome our participants. And I thank all those who have helped at York University, Professor Don Baisley, my team of coordinators, Sue Wise, Marley Whittle, Nilu Nazemzadeh from York International, Mary Rose Tala, Luke Lee with Helen Balderrama's support, from Hoppen, Alessandra Signa, from Grantham Institute, Neil Jennings, from German Development Institute, Maria Alexandrova and Andrew Deneau, who were contact points, and student volunteers and student note takers. Thank you. A few remarks before as we open the plenary roundtable. This workshop follows Chatham House rule, which means that you may refer to what has been said, but not the person who said it. We request all our note takers and all our participants to follow this rule. On the chat box, you will find valuable information, such as links to live note-taking documents for each workshop. We ask that the moderators for workshops put links to the live note-taking document specific to their workshops, and rapporteurs will take notes. Participants are encouraged to add notes and collaborate by adding comments and resources. The workshop sessions will be recorded for reference and archival purposes. The plenary stage sessions, such as this one that we are in, are going to be recorded and may be posted on a website for information and educational purposes. We do have an official side event at COP26, and it is going to take place on this topic on Friday, the 5th of November. I welcome everyone to tune into it and to follow it. We are also forming a working group to collaborate on a deliverable during this workshop. And I asked the link to the form to complete in order to sign up here in the chat box. I welcome everyone to consider joining our working group. And we are pleased to feature the music of Toronto artist Adam Shurkin, an acclaimed musician from Toronto who founded the Piano Lunaire, a new gen Toronto-based organization that produces performances and recordings. And we're very pleased that we will be listening to this music during breaks. And it is now my pleasure to welcome the co-chair of this plenary roundtable to co-chair with me throughout the rest of our time. Dr. Sander Chan. Sander, you need no introductions. You are a senior researcher at the Global Center on Adaptation. And so you are also affiliated with the Synergies of Planetary Health Research Initiative as a co-lead researcher. Welcome. I turn over to you to introduce our speakers and moderate. You have the floor, Sander.
Thank you very much, Idil, and thank you all for joining this roundtable on multi-level joint action for climate, nature, and people. I'm, as Idil said, a senior researcher on non-state action at the Global Center on Adaptation, specializing in the effectiveness of non-state, subnational, and collaborative actions. And indeed, we see a convergence between climate and biodiversity governance in that they all adopt governance by goals, as well as a whole of society approach. Both the UN climate change and the UN biodiversity regimes have now platforms to elicit non-state, subnational, and cooperative commitments. In climate governance, much attention has been given to the mitigation potential of such commitments. However, we cannot ignore their linkages to biodiversity and the livelihoods of local and indigenous communities. And that is why Idil and I have been working together to understand the influence and impact of such non-state and subnational commitments. There's great potential in such actions, but they need to be guided by sound ecological science, they need to be credible, and they must respect indigenous rights and knowledge. One particular challenge I would like to highlight is that more action is not necessarily better. Increasing fragmentation in biodiversity and climate governance might become an obstacle to coordination, scaling, and the replication of good practices. Now, I'm honored to moderate this excellent panel, and we do need to keep within tight time constraints. I would therefore like to ask all panelists to limit your intervention to 5 to 6 minutes. For the audience, please do post your questions in the chat. We will discuss them after our panelists' contributions. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our first panelist, Dr. Elsat Humani. Dr. Elsat Humani is an expert in international environmental law and policy with a focus on governance of biodiversity and emerging technologies. She is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow at the University of Trento in Italy, working on the governance of synthetic biology. Elsa has been following international negotiations on biodiversity since 1999 and as a writer for the reporting services of the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And she has also recently published a book on fair and equitable benefit sharing in agriculture. Elsa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sander, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to this event. So I was asked to provide a snapshot of the current state of the biodiversity negotiations following the first part of the UN Biodiversity Conference held last week in Kunming. As you know, the main negotiating outcome is expected to be a global biodiversity framework for the post-2020 era. Negotiations have been delayed due to the COVID pandemic, although we must say that a significant amount of technical work and online consultations have taken place in the last 2 years in an effort to enhance mutual understanding on controversial matters and maintain the momentum. That said, maintaining the political momentum and raising ambition was the main objective of the first part of the meeting in Kunming, on top of the necessary administrative and budgetary matters. The highlights. The meeting adopted the Kunming Declaration, which was not negotiated and does not represent the consensus of parties. and held a number of financial commitments, including from China and Japan. So no negotiations were held on the Global Biodiversity Framework. Negotiations will resume in January 2022 in Geneva, in person, after a very long time. A huge amount of work remains to be done. The report of the last meeting of the working group on the Global Biodiversity Framework in August, I mean, you can check it online, is a burdensome document of something like 150 pages, collating parties' views under the provisions of the first draft of the framework as was circulated by the co-chairs of the working group. So in this context, and as an input to the discussion, I want to raise 5 points that I consider them to be central for a successful outcome. First, the issue of balance. Balance between the 3 objectives of the Convention and between the different building blocks, let's say, of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Ambitious targets, commitments on means of implementation, and the setting up of some kind of monitoring and review mechanism that would enhance compliance and accountability. This need for balance, particularly between the Convention's objectives, is best illustrated by continued and very controversial debates on benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources. Reaching agreement on some sort of benefit sharing from use of digital sequence information is a red line for many developing countries in the negotiations and by now has great political importance. Second, the issue of synergies. Both synergies with other MEAs, particularly with regard to climate change, but also health and sustainable development. In the last 2 years, enhanced understanding has been achieved on this, also as a result of the joint IPBES-IPCC report. However, the extent and modalities of such synergies have been controversial in the CBD negotiations, with the debate concentrating on the use or not of the term nature-based solutions in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Third, the ambition to address root causes and drivers of change in the Global Biodiversity Framework. This, according to many, would require reaching beyond the environment realm to the world of trade and global value chains, including scrutinizing international finance, trade, and investment law. Fourth, the question of governance, including by promoting equity-related considerations and a rights-based approach in the negotiations, notably with regard to the traditional knowledge, but also more sensitive issues such as land rights of indigenous peoples. And let's note here the recent adoption of a human right to a healthy environment by the UN Human Rights Council, which could hopefully have an impact on the negotiations. But the question of governance is also linked to the need to tackle finance-related issues to a global scale to address global inequities, such as, for instance, ODA-related commitments. And to conclude, 5, the role of China, who holds the presidency as the host country. China has a rather unique legal and institutional structure and tradition. It is hard to predict its role during the final stretch of the negotiations in Kunming, when the host country usually makes an extra effort for successful conclusion. And I will leave it at that for now. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elsa. And I would like to remind the audience to post your questions in the chat, and we will come back to you and discuss them afterwards. Next, we are very glad to have Dr. Oscar Wiedeberg, who is an assistant professor at the Institute for Environmental Studies. He studies and teaches global sustainability governance, primarily focusing on the connections between state and non-state actors. Oscar has published extensively on a variety of global environmental issues. He regularly participates in the public debate on environment, climate, and energy, and he currently also leads a project on transnational biodiversity initiatives. Oscar, we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Sander, and thanks a lot for having me. So first, I really want to say thanks a lot, Idil and Sander, and the whole organization team for pulling this really fantastic event together. I think it's really a salient topic to look at, let's say, the climate biodiversity nexus, and I'm really honored, I must say, to be able to share my 2 cents. Already after 5 minutes listening to Elsa, I learned really a lot. So I want to say that my experience is primarily based on work carried out by our team of people at my institute, the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Free University of Amsterdam. And we do a lot of this work together with the Dutch Environmental Assessment Agency, where we try to support them in in their work of supporting the negotiations of the CBD, primarily looking at non-state subnational action. Also, I've been working on climate change, but biodiversity has really been the focus when it comes to this nexus work. And we've been building up this work over the last, let's say, 4 years under a project name which is currently called BioStar, when we look at how partnerships and initiatives work on biodiversity-related topics. We built up a database of around 600 initiatives that are working transnational on biodiversity, and much of my, let's say, thinking around this have been shaped by this work of trying to build up a database. Now, in the background documents, and something that has been alluded to a lot when we talk about the nexus, is the workshop report that came out a few months ago from the IPBES and IPCC. They held a common workshop, and where they wrote a workshop document where they lament the functional separation, they call it, between the international conventions and the international bodies that are set up to address both biodiversity loss and climate change. And also, I think rightly so, they complain about the siloed research communities that are studying climate change and biodiversity. And in worst case, they argue, and I think they're correct, this can really lead to inadvertently, let's say, that some solutions that we present in one field will negatively or adversely affect another. Maybe not a new insight for many governance scholars working on climate and biodiversity, but I think really raising it and putting it on the agenda at a good point. So I think I really agree with a lot of the basic premises that the IPBES and IPCC report brings forward. We really need to start to think about climate change and biodiversity loss conjointly. But while they discuss a lot of interesting points in that report, I would like to nuance some of their findings that they come up with. So one thing that the report is saying is basically we kind of lack these mechanisms for joining climate change and biodiversity. And while that might be true in terms of the COPs and international conventions, if you look beyond the confines of the COPs, I think you see something different. In the BioStar project, we have identified and analyzed hundreds of cooperative initiatives that already work on biodiversity and climate change in an integral way, right? The database contains some 200 of those types of initiatives. One of the often discussed examples is the Bonn Challenge, for example, on restoring degraded and restored land. And under this challenge, countries and others pledge to restore X amount of land, and the goal is to eventually have 350 million hectares restored by 2030. Now, I think we can have a good discussion on whether the approach that the Bonn Challenge is taking is good in terms of actually contributing to both climate change and biodiversity goals. But the fact of the matter is actually there. The initiative is there, and there are hundreds of others that are similar. So for us researchers, there's already this rich treasure trove of governance, let's say, attempts beyond what just governments are doing in the COPs on trying to integrate biodiversity and climate change. And I think we can learn a lot from that. The second thing I want to make is I think we as researchers need to understand and take a more of a nexus approach to collaborative and multi-level approaches such as cooperative initiatives and partnerships. I think our understanding of how these initiatives create synergies and how they handle trade-offs between biodiversity and climate change is rudimentary at best. We have a lot of good research on similar initiatives and partnerships, for example, on the Type 2 partnerships that came out of the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, or cooperative initiatives for climate change, which Sander and Idil have been doing lots of great work on over the last 10 years. But very few people have started to look at these initiatives and partnerships from a nexus lens, right? So to trying to understand how do they bridge climate change and biodiversity, and what are the effects of that? So how do initiatives deal with situations such as the Bond Challenge, deal with situations where they might have even competing policy goals, and what are the effects? And I think particularly interesting, and this is, I think, very, very, let's say, on the forefront of let's say, political science, policy analysis, governance studies, is really to understand how the different initiatives and partnerships interact. There is a virtual ecosystem of cooperative initiatives, international organizations, partnerships that are coexisting with international conventions, right? And we're starting to see more bridging platforms, such as Sander mentioned, between the action agendas, for example, that also Elsa mentioned, but also in both climate change and biodiversity, right? So we're starting to see how the two worlds are not colliding, but at least acknowledging each other. So to understand how the ecosystem works is something that I think is an important research challenge. Third and finally, I think research should really, in my view, try to contribute to harness the potentials of initiatives to contribute to both curbing climate change while bending the curve on biodiversity loss. Now, this means that, and I think this event's a good start, it means to actually start to engage critically with decision makers at various levels from different parts of society to learn from them and how we can communicate our research in the clearest way possible. So in my experience, I think the policy networks around climate change and biodiversity really have quite different characteristics, not only the policy networks, but also the research networks. So it might even, I think this is also actually noted and reflected in the IPBES-IPCC report. So here, creating this common language to understand each other's concerns, I think can become very beneficial. So finally, and I want to really keep it within 5 minutes to allow some time for discussions. My hope and what I want to work towards is really a future where the two communities, so on climate change and biodiversity, of researchers and practitioners start to talk to each other. So take, for instance, on data sharing. So many of the cooperative initiatives that we have in our BioStar database are geared towards collecting, synthesizing, and sharing data. The CDP, for example, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, they really collect data on how companies engage with climate change, but also on forests and biodiversity, right? And there are a lot of similar networks that do the same things for citizen networks. Now, can you imagine the power if we start to combine that type of voluntary transnational data gathering with governance data, with geospatial data, with biophysical data on, for instance, remote sensing, then we think we have a very potent and particularly promising research avenue, right? However, the key thing for such projects to take place is really to build trust and understanding both across climate change and biodiversity groups, as well as researchers and practitioners, right? So there is this group building, this practitioner building, this, let's say, community of practice building that is starting to take place, and I think this workshop is really a great seed to do that, and which I hope that we can continue and be allowed to grow. So finally, and I want to finish to say that I hope this work that we do here and that we start to do here can be done in close cooperation with the custodians of the UN-based databases and the action agendas, because it's starting to come out there, and to really build this feedback loop between data collection, between analysis, between accountability mechanisms, etc., and in the intergovernmental policy processes, just to create synergies between the work that we're doing and the COPs. So building mechanisms really for accountability to, I think, in the end, increase credibility of the whole non-state, subnational, multi-level space, which is already there and, let's say, at hand to harness. I think I'll stop there and really look forward to the coming discussion and to the coming days. Thanks a lot.
And thank you very much, Oscar. I couldn't agree with you that we really need to find the commonalities and the common language also between the biodiversity and climate change communities to work together on governance institutions that help both spheres of governance. Next, we have the pleasure to welcome Alexandra Depress. She is a research fellow and international climate governance fellow at IDRI, which is an independent policy research institute and a multi-stakeholder dialogue platform, which identifies the conditions and proposes tools to put sustainable development at the heart of international relations and public and private policies. Alexandra works on international climate governance and cooperation, and in this context, she closely follows, analyzes, and informs the UN climate negotiations and the transition of national public policies. Alexandra also lead authored the IDRI study on maximizing synergies and minimizing trade-offs between responses to climate change and biodiversity loss. Alexandra, please share your thoughts with us.
Yes, thank you so much, Sander and Idil. It's great to see that the collaboration we started at COP25 is continuing in multiple forms. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present today at this very interesting discussion. So indeed, I have been working a lot on these past 2 years, both on sort of like the conceptual links between climate and biodiversity crossing the different IPCC and IPBES reports, I guess before the joint report. And then also thinking through, well, what does this mean in terms of how can we better integrate policy, namely at the international level? So after all this kind of research thinking, we've also held different negotiator dialogues and different discussions. I really feel, especially now in advance of COP26, that we've really come to a conclusion that we will be, that I will present now, but that we're basically presenting also in a paper that will come out tomorrow, that given the level of planetary urgency we're in with both climate and biodiversity, we now really need to up the game in terms of aligning these two issues. And for that, what is super essential, as well as all the on-the-ground work that others here are doing, is really integrating biodiversity integrity within the idea of climate ambition. And so basically, we know that what we're working towards altogether is the goal of mid-century net zero emissions to keep and reach the 1.5 temperature goal. And yet the problem here is that this net zero concept is still a lot full of ambiguity regarding what is the place of the net and the zero. So obviously it's a question of balancing emissions with sinks. And yet the problem, and that's where the relation with biodiversity comes in, is that for the moment, it seems like countries and also a lot of businesses and other perhaps non-state actors seem to be banking way too much perhaps on the capacity both of sinks, natural sinks, to be able to absorb more fossil fuel emissions, basically offsetting, and also banking on future deployment of carbon dioxide removal techniques such as, for instance, bioenergy or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And so basically, there's a need to clarify at a scientific level, following up on the work of the IPCC and IPBES, what are sort of the sustainability thresholds of some climate mitigation solutions that actually might be very harmful to biodiversity. Because so far, this whole discussion on climate and biodiversity has focused a lot on the joint synergistic action we can do, which is obviously important, but it's very incomplete if we also hide we don't look at the trade-offs. And so this is really essential because recent research earlier this year found that 97% of IPCC 1.5 and 2 degree pathways or emission pathways to reach those goals actually use an amount of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage that goes above, that would imply basically more destruction of, or more land use, and therefore most likely more ecosystem damage. So this is why, for instance, in this paper that we've been writing, where we have like concrete proposals for COP26, we really think that in the sort of that parties really need to provide a strong signal that this question of net zero, the ambiguity around it, needs to end, and there needs to be, yes, we need to really understand what is the limit of that we can depend on sinks, because basically, if we can only depend very little on sinks, that means that the only way to reach climate goals and biodiversity goals is actually to mitigate way more than what we're doing today. So in that sense, we also think that really having an actual scientific paper by the IPCC and IPBES would be essential to follow up on the work they've been doing. And I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and also for pointing out, this big campaign around net zero, the race to zero, and there's promises related to that. A big promise related to the Paris Agreement to have a net zero future by the second half of the century, but also the danger of banking on future carbon removal. Thank you very much. And with this, I think we can invite all panelists for a round of discussion with the audience. And I do see a question here from Dawn Basily, and I assume that it is directed to Oscar. Dawn asks that, it's not a new insight that governance scholars are often siloed, and all types of scientists are siloed. And in research, there doesn't seem to be enough incentives for scholars to reach across disciplines and to collaborate. Oscar, do you see a solution there?
Right. Great. Thanks a lot for that question, Dawn. And I think it's very apt observation. I mean, this goes, of course, this is a broader question than just nature, biodiversity, and climate change, right? It's just conducting interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research is difficult. I do think there is progress though in the biodiversity climate area, as we find these, as I said before, boundary, let's say, concepts such as nature-based solutions. Saying what you think about it, it does seems to, catch on. And we do see that things, organizations such as the European Union and their research money really are funding large projects on nature-based solutions. I mean, Naturebased is a good example where you really see biodiversity and climate change scholars working together. I do think also there's a great space, for example, in the foundation space to get funding for this. And I think in general, funding bodies are getting more and more open to, let's say, to funding this kind of research. So at least in Europe, I think there is a movement towards the right direction. What we can do is, push the funding bodies to help us out.
Thank you. And Elsa, thank you for highlighting the key issues and the key developments coming from the first part of COP15 and the biodiversity negotiations. However, the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is not only CBD, right? It is a much broader framework. So my question to you is, what needs to happen outside of the CBD?
Well, first it needs to be adopted in the context of the CBD, right? So the CBD parties need to agree to that. After that, I guess the second step would be for like it happened with the current strategic plan, that the rest of the biodiversity-related conventions will abide to it, will have some kind of declaration, to be within it. Now, are you talking about like in a normative sense or in an implementation sense? Because I mean, if you talk about implementation, I think it requires like again, as you mentioned in your introduction, a whole of government, whole of society, and the whole of the international legal order, if you want, approach for any kind of biodiversity framework to be implemented. So I mean, that's why I referred in my introduction at the need to also reach out to trade agreements and investment agreements, like beyond the usual MEAs, because if we talk about mainstreaming biodiversity, much of it in practice depends on other sectors, so which are run by other international organizations, and when it comes to the national level, other ministries other than the Environment Ministry.
So actually, we do have a question on that actually for you, Elsa, coming from Fiona Kinneberg, and that is, you know, how to address trade, finance, and investment. In which fora should these discussions take place? So not necessarily only within CBD, from what I understand.
Well, yeah, the CBD cannot do much on this. I mean, there are a series of parties that consistently object to having any kind of agreement in the CBD in any kind of trade-related issue. I mean, that's why progress on incentives in the CBD has been so slow over the last years. On the other hand, I mean, there are many immediately relevant negotiations going on. For instance, the negotiations for fishery subsidies under the WTO are immediately relevant to the biodiversity negotiations. However, I mean, if we say that building interlinkages between biodiversity and climate is difficult, I mean, we cannot even imagine how difficult it is to bring interlinkages with the WTO. I mean, I haven't really checked the last couple of years, but until very recently, WTO would not even accept the CBD Secretariat as an observer at the negotiations. So we're talking about really low standards there for like participation of MEAs. And I mean, it's still trade negotiation at a multilateral level. There is a myriad of bilateral and trilateral negotiations going on trade and investment, touching upon, for instance, land, which is very much related both to biodiversity and climate, that even transparency is very limited.
Yeah, so a lot of hurdles to take also outside of the CBD. Of course, it starts with, you know, a good outcome within the CBD negotiations. But I would say maybe, you know, the role of WTO or other international organizations need to be also understood more and investigated more. Alexandra, thank you very much for pointing out the race to zero, because that is the race that the campaign by the high-level climate action champions that seem to be attention-grabbing, headline-grabbing to some extent. Now, they have noticed that there was a lot of critique, which you also referred to, that net zero can be a different form of almost greenwashing, right? If you bank on future commitments, if you bank on, buying offsets. However, they have come up with more stringent criteria. For instance, the participants to the net zero campaign, they have to demonstrate that they how they are going to halve their emissions by 2030. They have to add some clarity on the scope of the emissions that they reduce. They have to add specificity on their measures. They have to also introduce leadership practices and practices on equity empowerment. What else would you require from a race to zero? There's also a race to resilience, by the way, to make sure to avoid trade-offs and maximize synergies. What criteria would you add?
Yes, thank you, Sander. No, it's very interesting because, of course, the net zero discussion is happening at all different levels, and it's like this global goal, and that's ultimately where it makes the most sense. And then, of course, action at the level of, all the action of countries and of businesses and non-state actors is a contribution to the ultimate net zero. But so I haven't looked recently in detail at those guidelines, but I guess this is where I would really insist again, and this has been through a lot of thought over the past few years, on the role of more authoritative science to follow up on the really excellent first step that the IPCC and IPBES took together. But of course, as you mostly know, the workshop report is not an official assessment report, and therefore doesn't have the same weight and the same in-depth analysis, even though it's an excellent start, of course, but it's not going to be taken as seriously, and it hasn't really detailed out. The problem is it hasn't detailed out what pathways to 1.5 are actually viable in light of the even more in light of ecological boundaries. I was very struck by this research that pointed out that 97% of the scenarios presented by the IPCC use an amount of bioenergy that's too large. That is the vast majority of the scenarios. And so the problem there is that basically not having clarity on what actually is the limit of sinks is keeping us in this collective imaginary and fantasy that we can rely on them, and therefore maybe makes us get the impression that the level of even level of what we would call today ambitious mitigation is actually not enough. So I think that's the main meta point. So I think, to be honest, I don't see why countries or companies would be more ambitious today if they don't have the actual clarity from science. So that's why I think, science, we would, Anyway, so I'll leave it there because I've been too long, but thanks.
Thank you. And actually, we do have a question coming from Giancarlo Rodriguez from the German Development Institute. And maybe I can address this one to Oscar. Alexandra touched upon it. There's a lot of support for nature-based solutions, but are nature-based solutions transformative? And how do we make sure, or do nature-based solutions challenge business as usual at all?
Wow, that's a good question. So I think to have this. There's a lot of debate. First of all, I think there's a lot of promise there, and I think there's some communities who are very happy about nature-based solutions as a concept. I think there are others who are slightly more skeptical, both scientists and practitioners. So far I have not seen the evidence that suggests that nature-based solutions are transformative, but I do think that might come. But I do think they form a very important. They have a very different. They form a very different purpose, and that's what I talked about. Trying to figure out, this common language. So if we're gonna have practitioners and scientists, as Alexandra was talking about, from both climate change and biodiversity to talk to each other, we need to have some kind of common language. And the nature-based solutions really kind of works in both camps. Now, you can be for or against it. We can discuss it and we can calculate things around it, but at least we talk about something together. If I talk about ecological integrity or, mean species abundance, something like with a climate scientist, they don't, really relate to that. And it's the other way around to a biodiversity scholar. Same thing with practitioners, right? You would have the same type of divide, I think. But I think the nature-based solutions concept have a different purpose. And I really hope that we can kind of expand that conceptual toolbox, as I would call it, but just, the type of words that we use to describe the synergies and the trade-offs that we want to try to reach. I hope that's at least my 2 cents on that.
Thank you very much. And before we close the panel, unfortunately, our time for discussion is very, very limited. But we still have a day and also a day and a half almost to go to discuss all these matters. I do want to quickly feature a comment from Professor Don Basile at York University, who also talks about that transdisciplinary science policy cooperation, that is not something new, and maybe we can learn from taking a historical policy perspective. Unfortunately, we cannot discuss it given the limited time within this panel. However, I would like to thank all panelists and also the audience for your questions and for your great inputs. Over to you, Idil.
Thank you, and I want to thank this exciting line of panelists, Alexandra, Elsa, Oscar, and Sander, for excellent moderation and discussion. Indeed, we are going to close this session. However, because this plenary is an introductory plenary, we specifically reserved a video to punctuate this opening session. And we're going to run this, as this is actually the welcoming remark from the Daedalus Institute for Global Health Research. And after that, there will be a break where we will listen to music. So stay around on Hopin. But right now, I'm going to call for the punctuation of this opening plenary with the video from the Daedalus Institute to complete our welcoming to everyone. Thank you. Over to you, Tech Room.
Greetings and welcome. My name is Mary Viktorovich. As the interim director of the Daedalus Institute for Global Health Research at York University, it's great to help open this week's knowledge exchange dialogue. We look forward to the opportunity to collaborate as we prepare for next month's COP26 events. Thank you, Professor Idil Boran, for initiating this project and bringing us together. The Daedalus Institute is a proud partner institution. We use critical problem-solving approaches to pursue effectiveness, equity, and excellence in global health research. This includes contributions toward planetary health, global health and humanitarianism, and global health foresighting. Many of you will meet our brilliant postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Bjomkesh Telekdar, whose research focuses on the intersection of health, sustainable development, climate change, food, and agriculture. To learn more about our work, please visit our website. We're excited to be part of this event with so many engaged researchers and practitioners. These concurrent sessions cover a variety of issues, and I'm sure that our active engagement will help us share critical knowledge and lessons to establish joint action for addressing climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development. Have a wonderful two-day session.
Hello, my name's Adam Shurkin. I'm a pianist and composer based in New York and Toronto, and it's a thrill to be with you here today to present for the multi-level joint action for climate, nature, and people. Ahead of the upcoming Glasgow Climate Conference, I'm delighted to offer some music of my own entitled Wolf Scenes. I think a lot about my relationship to the natural world and our relationship as a species to our fellow animals, creatures, and everything else we share this habitat called Earth with. 2 years ago, I was commissioned to write music for solo piano, left hand alone, and I was inspired by wolves. Wolves in their many guises, wolves in their relationship to us, wolves in their shrinking habitat, wolves in their howling, their beautiful coats, and in their very mammalian tendencies to care for their own and protect their young. The first piece is entitled Light Silver, which talks about the beautiful fur these animals have. The second is entitled Sheep's Blood, which is a little bit graphic and explicit, but it does talk about their prey items and their natural relationship to their food chain. Lastly, Hollow is about a very comforting and nurturing aspect to these animals' lives, where they find a den or a cave or a hollow in which to overwinter to rear their young. I'd like to offer this presentation alongside some art, acrylics on canvas created by painter based in Toronto, Gail Williams. This is from a live recording that was given at the world premiere performance of Wolf Scenes in 2018, presented at the Canadian Music Centre in Toronto. Have a wonderful conference, and I hope you enjoy this presentation.